Folks, we are back. We are back to spread the message of Jokkul. After a harrowing experience reading through, yet again, Doolittle comments, we began to consider, we began to reevaluate, what is the message of Jokkul? What is the fundamental message of Jokkul? And if I had to boil it down, I would say the message is, the path of the warrior is gone. You can either be a priest or a merchant. Those are your choices. Now we can trace this development because clearly this is not how things began. Clearly we look at the animal kingdoms, we see even the bacterial world, even the world of the viruses. We can see that the realm of the body and the competition of bodies against bodies, this warrior contest, we can see this Darwinian conflict going on for millennia. And so clearly this lack of a warrior path for humanity, this is something which has come to pass, not instantaneously, but it has developed. And we can trace it first, I would say, with the transition from the Neolithic to the Paleolithic, or the reverse, I should say, the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. With a caveat here, we might say that perhaps the Neanderthal extinction, Homo sapiens entering into Europe, perhaps this represents an important progression which allows us to get into the Neolithic. Perhaps this is something which is necessary. Perhaps the Neanderthal is too instinctual. He is too rooted in the hunt. It's hard to determine what the actual psychological makeup of the Neanderthals was, but we might speculate, we might propose theories and a hypothesis that maybe the Neanderthals were extremely instinctual. Those big brains that they had contained a lot of instinctual information in the same way that animals are born knowing how to hunt. Perhaps the Neanderthal was born knowing how to hunt, and because the Neanderthal was so traditional, with a capital T, in its pursuit of hunting in Northern Europe, that perhaps the Neanderthal could never be trained or dissuaded from his Paleolithic path, and perhaps he could never become a Neolithic farmer. And perhaps, therefore, it was necessary that the Neanderthals be subject to genocide and that the Homo sapiens take over Europe. Perhaps this was a necessary precondition in order for the Neolithic Revolution to take place, which happens just southeast of Europe in the Fertile Crescent, which, if we understand population genetics, especially ancient population genetics, the Mediterranean region, was itself a region. There was not this strict divide, this strict border between Europe and the Middle East that we know of today, which has developed over many centuries due to various factors. The establishment of certain nation-states, certain empires, certain flows, certain migrations. There is now today this hard and fast border that we think of, which is not entirely true. Of course, the country of Bulgaria contains many Turkish-descended peoples. Greece, of course, has a lot of Mideastern admixture and so on and so forth. But if we are to kind of propose a black and white vision that there's Europe and there's the Middle East, well, this division didn't used to exist. And so when we talk about the Neolithic Revolution as a Middle Eastern revolution, we have to understand that at this time, most of Europe, or for a great deal of Europe's history, with ice ages, 12,000 years ago, that Europe has been covered by ice for a very long time. Down into Italy, we think of Italy as this warm, this nice tropical place. Italy used to have a sheet of ice covering northern Italy. There was a sheet of ice which covered northern Italy that divided Spain. You could enter into Spain, you could enter in Italy, you could enter into the Balkans. But all of Russia and all of Northern Europe was pretty much covered in ice. It's like Siberia. You couldn't go to, a German beach. You couldn't go to a beach of Normandy. It would all be frozen over, right? I may be exaggerating, but there was a different climate. And so when we talk about European peoples and the people who become European peoples and the ancestors of European peoples, that population was much more geographically situated toward the Fertile Crescent than it was toward Northern Europe. The populations which became Northern Europeans originated to a great degree from the Middle East. Now, there are essentially what's the picture that's emerging is there are essentially three groups of people who are the ancestors of modern-day Europeans. There are these Neolithic farmers, there are Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, and there is the Yamnaya culture, also known as the Indo-Europeans. But these three populations all have a common ancestor. And that common ancestor, that common population group from which these groups all descend, was much more shifted toward the Middle East for climatological reasons, which then later expanded up into Northern Europe as the millennia progressed. With climate change, we know climate changes, it changes, so there you go. Anyway, we get farming. And farming takes a Paleolithic society, which is mostly about warriors, and it takes, especially in Northern Europe, where meat is so important because you just can't do agriculture in the winter. It's just not possible, so you need to be hunting. It changes the game to a great degree. And it says we're no longer going to have a society of warriors who are hunting the mammoth, which is now a trope, but it was true, you hunted the mammoth. That went away. We actually made the mammoth go extinct. And eventually, or it might have been climatological, I don't know. Anyway, farming comes along, and farming transforms people from warriors into workers. And so this, I guess the Hindu term is Shudra. The Shudra is the worker class as opposed to the Kshatriya, which are the warrior class, which in the Scythian culture, which is an Indo-European culture, the warriors were at the top of society, the priests came second, then the merchants. But ultimately, we have the introduction of this warrior class, or this worker class. Warriors are converted into workers. And you go along through the centuries, and you see agriculture develops, and we get this thing called urbanism. And urbanism creates a society of strangers, which we didn't previously have. Before, we had a band of brothers. That was tribal society. Now you have a society of strangers, the city of strangers, urbanism. This creates a new psychological environment which introduces the merchant class, because now you have so many people, they can't just trade, they can't just share things in a kind of proto-communist way as Marx described, and he was pretty accurate in a lot of ways. They can't just share things, they have to trade, and that's where the merchant comes in as a middleman. So urbanism, through agriculture, creates this merchant class, and as we'll see, the merchant class is always the enemy of the warrior class, and they're always in competition with one another, and as we'll see, the merchant class eventually beats the warrior class out. So we see many conflicts throughout the centuries. We see urbanism, we see the rise of empires, we see the conflict between Carthage and Rome, and we can see that in some ways Rome is a warrior culture, and Carthage, descended from the Phoenicians, they're more of a trading mercantile culture. Rome wins temporarily, but Rome becomes more and more of a mercantile culture as the republic becomes an empire, and as the empire becomes a civilization. And then the civilization then collapses, and the mantle of Roman law is taken on by the Germans, who further develop the concept. And eventually we get a development of alchemy that becomes something like science, with people like Kepler, for instance. A lot of the early astronomers were also astrologers. So we see this link between alchemy, astrology, and then what becomes astronomy, early observation, empiricism, science, which develops into secular humanism, which actually comes before the split of the Catholic Church. We think of secular humanism as something very new, but humanism itself predates the Protestant Catholic schism, which comes with people like Martin Luther, Henry VIII. What Henry VIII does is when he seizes the lands of the church, he does not distribute it among the aristocracy, because Henry VIII wanted to make money. And so instead he sold it to the highest bidder. Now this was one of the first times in English history that instead of land being owned because of ancestral rights of warrior kings and warrior aristocrats, land was now owned, and therefore people were ennobled because they were successful merchants. So this was a new development. At the same time, this was already happening in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was selling the rights of ennoblement to merchants, Jewish merchants, Turkish merchants, Buddhist, Mongolian merchants. Anyone who would come into Poland, they just needed to be rich and they could become part of the aristocracy. So this was subverting, again, that Paleolithic idea of a band of brothers who are related to one another by kinship. Now it's all about a market in which land and property and status is just bought and sold to whoever can be the best middleman in the distribution of goods across urban centers, often these port cities, in first the Middle East and then spreading up into Northern Europe. By the time of the Black Plague, which comes a little bit before Henry VIII, this concept of the mercantile fleet empire, which develops into the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch Empire and then eventually the British Empire. This is very important. This is why the disease spreads so quickly in the way that it does, is because of these merchants who are traveling all around the Mediterranean and the Hanseatic League and the North Sea. So we continue with this, and eventually we get to a place where, with the development of firearms, having a highly trained elite force of knights, like the Templar Knights or something like this, becomes outmoded, because now you can just give a mob of people a bunch of guns. You can give them pretty quick training on how to use a gun, and they're a much more effective fighting force than a knight in shining armor with a horse, and the horse has armor, and he's got a sword, and he has all these things. Basically, technology degrades the importance of the warrior class even further. So we continue with this into the Napoleonic era, where Napoleon, after the French Revolution, excuse my alarm, Napoleon is able to raise armies and have these fantastic conquests of Europe. He actually unites all of continental Europe together, and it's only Russia and England who stand against him. Ultimately, he loses because of dissatisfaction among the local population, disaster in the Russian winter, etc., etc. But we see the centralizing power of technology to destroy traditional warrior aristocracies and to bring about the mob, to bring about a mercantile ruling class, which at the same time, the people who defeat Napoleon are not old aristocrats, but it is the Rothschild banking family who chooses to support England over Napoleon. That is one of the decisive financial aspects that turns the tide of the Napoleonic Wars. So we're moving into the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution is kicking up. It is taking these peasant farmers who were still using their bodies, we might say, this bodily activity, their blood and soil. There's still a warrior aspect to it, the war against nature, Marduk against Tiamat in the Babylonian myths. So we might say, okay, well, fair enough. The peasant, the farmer, is still a warrior in spirit. This later becomes a Nazi concept of the farmer soldier. I forget if it's Bauer Soldat or Soldat Bauer, but the Nazis don't invent this, by the way. Nazis don't really invent very much. It's probably invented by one of the Ariosophists. And the Ariosophists are these occultists who are trying to bring back some kind of Indo-European revival in Europe, as they see that the Jews are really taking on a whole new role that they haven't had before. The Jews were never allowed to own land in Europe, and this only begins to change with the French Revolution, with Napoleonic law, and then finally the 1848 revolution takes that Napoleonic revolution in terms of law concerning Jews, and it expands it and explodes it. And so the Jews have new opportunities in ways that they didn't before, but we have to understand the fact that the Jews were never allowed to own land means the Jews were never farmers, the Jews were never warriors, they were never soldiers. They were completely disassociated with those roles, and they were forced into the role of the merchant. Now, albeit that was in some sense their choice to remain Jewish rather than convert to Christianity, as so many pagan Europeans had to do. So in a sense, these were the people who preferred to be a merchant rather than Christianize themselves. And so that is the position that they chose. So you can say it was forced on them, but you can also say there was an element of agency there. And so they remained Jewish, and they remained in this mercantile role, and with the 1848 revolution really opened up a lot of new possibilities for them, and they were really primed and prepared, because essentially when you have a people which is just forced into a narrow role, and there are all these dangers on the outside, the local farmers are always ready to do a pogrom, and you're always ready to be expelled. There are all these harsh pressures against the Jewish people, and this is sort of a fire that really hardens the Jewish people in the same way that we might take a sword, and by putting it in a forge and slamming it with a hammer, we actually make the sword stronger. And so in this way, people like Nietzsche come to evaluate the Jews as a future aristocracy for Europe, because they have been primed as a mercantile people to be harder and stronger and just more virile than the natural or the previous European aristocracy. Kalergi also says this. He's not Jewish either. He's half Japanese, half European, and he is one of the founders of the concept of the European Union, and he says the Jews are really primed to become the leaders of Europe because of their experience, because of their history, because of their position. They're really primed to be the new leaders of Europe. This is not accidental. And this is very logical. So we're seeing this progression, which goes back perhaps to the Neanderthals, perhaps to the Neolithic, perhaps to the rise of early cities and urbanism, and then later with civilizations and empires, and then eventually we get into alchemy, and we get into early humanism, which gives rise eventually to science in the Industrial Revolution, and then with the Industrial Revolution, we have, again, people moving away from the countryside, away from the farm, into the factory, into the hands of the capitalist, who is a merchant, who is a middleman, who does not work himself, but he merely owns the means of production, which creates things like a Marxist reaction. Karl Marx actually had his big debut. The Communist Manifesto comes in the 1848 revolution. So now everything is happening all at once. Before we could say, well, there was the Neanderthals, and that's like a certain chronological period, and then there was the Neolithic, and that's a period, and then maybe at the same time we also have urbanism, and then later you get the arrival of empires and civilizations and the naval trade, and then we see the development of alchemy into the idea of humanism as a philosophical school, and then we see the development of humanism with the Renaissance, and then the Renaissance into the Enlightenment and the Industrial Era, and then by the time you get to 1848, everything is just happening all at once, because you have the emancipation of the Jewish people, and you have the Communist Manifesto, which is a kind of reaction to industrial society, which is a kind of reaction to the mercantile aspect of society, and Karl Marx himself, although of Jewish descent, says some kind of anti-Semitic things when he says the essence of Judaism is merchandising and money. And so he says, he sort of rejects Judaism, and he says that Jews should leave Judaism and they should become Marxists, and a lot of them do. And you get this whole Marxist movement, which eventually leads to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and a lot of people are pretty scared about this, and they don't like it, because Marxist ideology is wrapped up with a lot of oppressed groups and a lot of resentments, and it's latching onto a lot of dangerous ideas, things like internationalism, things like feminism, things like atheism, for example. And so a lot of people, especially on the border with Russia, the traditional border between Russia and the West, that position is held by Germany. And so Germans who have just lost the First World War, by the way, right after the Russian Revolution, in 1917, there is the loss of the First World War in 1918, a year later. So the Germans are completely stripped of their military. They're only allowed to have an army of 100,000. There's basically a civil war raging in Germany. They're constantly, the Freikorps is trying to take over the government. The communists are trying to take over the government. There's constant violence. There's an economic collapse. There's a million Germans starved to death. The average German child grows up to be several inches shorter than his parents because of the malnutrition. There is another hyperinflation crisis in 1923 with the Ruhr crisis. And then in 1929 you get the Great Depression, which starts in America, but because America at this point has been tied through international finance through England and France and Germany through the system of war bonds and reparations, Germany also experiences an economic collapse. So they experienced 3 economic collapses in quick succession with only 6 years dividing each of them. And the Germans sort of decide enough is enough. And about half of the Germans go for the communists, about half of the Germans go for the Nazis, because they say, look, this democracy thing is not working. We need something radically different. We need something that's going to promise some form of a workers' revolution to bring us out of this poverty that we're experiencing. Meanwhile, the stockbrokers and bankers continue to get richer. We, working people, were starving in the streets. So at this point, the conservative aristocracy of Germany has a choice. Should we side with the communists or should we side with the Nazis? They choose to side with the Nazis. We all know what happens. Nazi Germany is an experiment that lasts about 12 years and is eventually crushed by a combined force of the capitalists and the communists together. That's a very brief moment in history up to now. I've already gone back to the Neanderthals. We've talked about all of this progression of history. So 12 years in the grand scheme of things is a very short time. But the limited history, the sense of history that we have today is so limited that we think of Nazism as the beginning of history, as sort of, there was this pre-Nazi period, which is like the Garden of Eden, and then the fall of humanity is kind of this Nazi period. And then after that, we're banished from Eden, and we're trying to reconnect with God. So this is sort of Genesis is rewritten to reposition Nazism as the serpent seducing Adam and Eve over to Nazism, and we have to reject that. So that's kind of, in a sense, where we're at in our current mythology of the world. And you have to know and you have to understand that a big part of National Socialism was rejecting mercantilism and the belief that warriors should rule society, that traditional European societies were ruled by a warrior aristocracy. That is the Nazi ideal, which is of course opposed by the communists who think that everything should be run by economic bureaucrats, or the capitalists who think everything should be run by economic bureaucrats, right? In either case, the priest class is kind of struggling to catch up, and the Catholics are wondering if they should side with the Nazis in some cases, or be anti-Nazi in other cases. And of course, the Pope at that time, I believe it was Pope Innocent, if I'm correct. And let me just fact check myself. Let's see if I search Nazi Pope, what's going to... Pope Pius the 12th, actually, not Innocent, so I'm glad I fact checked myself. Pope Pius XII, there were instances where many bishops and many cardinals spoke out against the Nazis and condemned them as anti-Catholic, but there were also cases where the Catholics collaborated and had an explicit concordat with the German government. So the priest class of various religions are trying to keep up with these developments even within Judaism, which again I've described as a mercantile group of people due to historical circumstance, both by choice and by circumstance. At the same time, there's this Zionist movement, which says that the Jewish people have to turn away from being rootless cosmopolitans, and they have to find their blood and soil in the nation of Israel. So they have to go there and be farmers for the first time in 2,000 years. And so this, even within Judaism, you see this divide between the more warrior-minded people, maybe represented by a Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the mercantile people, maybe represented by a George Soros. And so you have this conflict even within Judaism, within Catholicism, within Protestantism, within all kinds of walks in life. So the priest class is not this independent agent at this point. The priest class is either having to side with the fascists or it's having to side with the mercantile democracies. So this is where we're at, and we're being pushed more and more every day away from the warrior class and into the merchant class. And I'd love to end the video now. My chicken is burning. I'm going to have to check on it. This is what happens. This is what happens when you boil the chicken. You don't put enough water in there. And, yep, we definitely got some burning chicken action over here. So I'm going to have to add some water to that now. Add a little bit of water to my burning chicken. Alright, that's fair enough. That's good. It sucks. Still, nobody's giving me a solution. Is there like a program? Excuse me, sir. Is there a program I can download? I'm using Photo Booth on a Mac, Apple desktop computer. Is there another program I can download? I know OBS is a program, but is there a simple program I can download for Apple, which I just open it up, I press play, it records a video from a webcam, and then I can take that video file and I can upload it to YouTube? Is there a program like that which has a pause button? Because I would love a pause button, because I don't want to have to remake the whole video. I don't want to have to stop the video and then start a new video and then go into iMovie and then put the two videos together and then process that. I don't want to do all that. So please, spend some time, Google search this, because I can't Google search. You need to do it for me. So we're going to Google search that. We're going to turn off that, turn on this. And we're going to get back to where we were. With our brief, that was a commercial interruption for chicken, boiled chicken. It's great, it's healthy. Get the drumsticks with the bones, because bones contain a lot of nutrients and minerals that you can eat and be a healthy person. That's what it's all about, right? So basically we were talking about the division within various cultural religious groups between the warrior class and the merchant class, and the priest class is kind of confused and doesn't know which way it should go. It's not really independent, and we see this with the rise of atheism, that religion as a force is less autocratic or less authoritative in its own right. It seems to be following other power centers and being led along by other power centers. And we can, of course, look at the post-war world, and we can look at how technology has developed further with things like the internet, and how the warrior class matters even less, and how more and more what really matters is money and finances. And what really matters less and less is not resources, but it is services. People are less and less concerned with how do I feed my family, and they're more and more concerned with how can I afford a new graphical update to my League of Legends, or what's the Fortnite, how can I afford, I need a new skin for my Fortnite account or something like that. People are purchasing, fake things. They're purchasing graphical updates in a video game rather than purchasing food for their children. So we've had a huge shift in the first world in terms of economic demand. What is the economy surrounding? What are the needs and desires of people? The porn industry has exploded in a way that just didn't exist before. Before, there was a brothel industry. You would go and you'd have sex with a woman. Or there were also gay brothels. You could have sex with men. But now we don't have that physical, corporeal sex. We have this virtual, videographic sex. So again, we can see in each case, every sector of society, every aspect of the economy, we can see ways in which we've shifted from the soil to the mind, or we've shifted from the body into the realm of ideas, or we've shifted from the concrete to the imaginary, or we've shifted from something tangible that we can touch into something that's kind of up in the clouds, or something that's digital. Literally, we talk about where is your data stored? Oh, it's in the cloud. It's in cloud computing, cloud storage. So even that metaphor itself, to say it's up in the clouds, implies a kind of a move into the mind rather than being in your body. So all of this indicates a shift away from the necessity of the warrior class, as we saw in Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies, as we see in animal species. We see this necessity of the warrior, necessity of the body, this Darwinian struggle of the body. We've seen this shift with the elimination of the Neanderthals, with the elimination of the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, with the introduction of urbanism, cities, civilizations, with the introduction of things like I was about to say the Merchant of Venice, but that is a play by Shakespeare, but more broadly, Venice as a mercantile empire, the Hanseatic League, the sponsorship of alchemy, which leads to astrology, which leads to astronomy, which leads to this humanistic, scientific, empirical tradition that gives us scientific progress, that gives us the Industrial Revolution, that liberates the peasants from the farms and the fields and takes them away from that sort of blood and soil work and brings them into factories, that leads to the conditions that Marx and Engels complain about, and the conditions of the English worker, whatever the pamphlet is called, that leads to the Communist Manifesto and the revolutions of 1848, and the emancipation of the Jewish people, and the development of the Bolshevik Revolution, which has as a consequence the Nazi regime, which lasts for 12 years, and then the new myth of Western civilization, which is, Nazism represents the fruit of good and evil, or fruit from the tree of good and evil. We must not eat this as the evil beyond all evils. And that is the founding negative myth. In the same way that we read Genesis, so we see this founding negative myth, the fall of man, we can see Nazism in secular humanist myth takes the place of the fall of man in Genesis. We see the development of transgenderism. We see the development of feminism. We see the development of the victimology totem pole, where this mother morality, where whoever is the most suffering or whoever complains the most is at the top of the progressive stack. We see all of these factors that really harm warrior culture and the warrior ethos. The victimary ethos is completely opposite to the warrior ethos because it is a masochistic rather than a sadistic ethos. And the warrior ethos is a sadistic ethos. It says it's good to hurt your enemies, it's good to conquer, it's good to win. And so victimary narratives and feminism and the worship of the weak and the hatred of toxic masculinity, the hatred of Indo-Europeans who are primarily a warrior aristocracy, all of these developments are really tied together. All of these developments are really connected with one another. And they just form this thesis that the warrior class is hollowing out. The warrior class is becoming obsolete. The warrior class is under attack from multiple dimensions. There's a racial, ethnic dimension. There's a religious dimension. There is an economic dimension. There are all kinds of factors which are making the warrior class obsolete, and as it becomes more obsolete, it becomes less powerful, and as it becomes less powerful, it becomes more vulnerable to attack, and as it becomes more vulnerable to attack, you see the mainstream media promoting ideas which implicitly attack the warrior class, whether it's through some kind of anti-imperial idea, which then becomes anti-whiteness, or whether it's through some kind of anti-male idea, which then becomes feminism, or whether it's through some kind of anti-authoritarian idea, which becomes something like democracy and human rights. So we can see everywhere it is reflected, everywhere it is the same thing, everywhere it is repeating the same trend that we can trace back to the Neanderthals, the Neolithic, the Industrial Revolution, up to the present day. And we see this trend being quite deep and not being superficial, not merely being, as Julius Evola said, as, oh, all my ideas were natural before the French Revolution. I think Julius Evola is a superficial thinker. I think when he says that, at least, I mean, maybe that quote doesn't define his whole body of work, but that quote, which is so often taken to be a typical summation of the works of Evola and the school of the traditionalists, it is a superficial, and it is a silly, and it is a stupid idea. And much more accurate is the Hindu conception of the yugas. And the Kali Yuga is not something that started in the French Revolution. The Kali Yuga has been happening for 10,000 years or more. I don't know the exact dates. In fact, we can look it up. When did the Kali Yuga dating? When did the Kali Yuga begin? No, I don't think the Kali Yuga has ended yet. I think we're in the Kali Yuga now. Thank you. The Krishna's departure marks the end of the Dvapara Yuga and the start of the Kali Yuga, which is dated to 3102 BCE. So apparently the Kali Yuga is approximately 5,000 years old, which is a lot more appropriate than saying something like, yeah, well, before the French Revolution, everything was fine and great. Actually, no. Actually, humanity has been undergoing traumatic psychological changes because of these environmental changes, which admittedly we have created ourselves. Interestingly enough, we are one of these animals that is somewhat unique in the sense that we have changed our environment to such a degree that we don't even recognize our own environment. We feel alienated from our environment. We don't feel like we belong. We feel like this is crazy. We want to go back to nature. We want to be environmentalists. We want to be primitivists. We want to be barbarians. We want to be anarchists. We want to get out of this place. Heidegger described this. He described this concept of feeling entrapped by classification, which is a feeling that one gets in a civilization, which we have created, right? So there is this conflict where it's like human society, human civilization has created something, but human individuals within that society feel alienated from a product that we ourselves have made. So it is a very stressful, anxious, depressing, crazy time that we live in to be a human being, especially for those who are of a warrior disposition. Now, again, referencing the Hindu tradition, there are three types of people: the tamasic, who are the workers, the rajasic, who are the warriors, and then there is the priestly type, which is the sattvic. I didn't even have to look it up, the sattvic type. So these three types, basically, when we look at the merchants are kind of the elite tamasic type. And the kshatriya, the warrior class, is the rajasic type. and the Sattvic, the priestly class, is the Brahmin type. And these three dispositions we know through genetics, we know through epigenetics. We know that a lot, through twin studies, we know that a lot of someone's disposition, whether they're going to be more athletic or not athletic. We know this in bodybuilding. We know some people, they can gain muscle really easily. Other people's, they're hard gainers. We know a lot of it is genetic. We know a lot of it is epigenetic. And so different people have different dispositions, whether that's environmentally determined in childhood, whether it's genetic. We just know that at some point we come to a place where we say, I have a disposition. I am a warrior. I am a priest. I am a merchant. We have these broadly speaking, we have these dispositions. We have these passions. And so people are wishing for a golden age that hasn't existed for a long time. People implicitly want to be hunter-gatherers. This is why we play video games like Skyrim, where it's a big open world and you can run around, you can run through the mountains and go Fusroda, and you could fight with swords. This is people hearkening back to an earlier time, which is more of a warrior ethos predominating over society and human action, determined who is successful, who is a failure, who is high status, who is low status. It was a warrior-led society. It was a warrior's world. Well, we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world where merchants predominate, and the ability to be a warrior is criminalized each and every day. Even the concept of hate speech. Hate speech should just be called warrior speech. It's the kind of speech that warriors use. Another word for hate speech is fighting words. Fighting words. Those are words of warriors. So the path of the warrior is being criminalized. It is criminal to be violent. It's criminal to defend yourself against migrants. It's criminal to kill people who break into your home. It is criminal to use hate speech or fighting words. It is criminal to disturb the peace. It is criminal to be toxically masculine. It is criminal to sexually harass a woman, which means just being a man and, being brash and being abrasive and, being fully yourself and being patriarchal. That is being criminalized. So we see that the warrior class is being criminalized. Now, a naive person, and again, someone who would just look at that quote from Evola and say, well, I just believed in all the things we believed in before the French Revolution. A naive person is going to look at that and say, oh my gosh, it's all the French Revolution's fault. The French Revolution just popped out of nowhere for no reason at all, just completely interrupted millions of years of traditionalism. We just need to turn back the clock to, I guess the 17th century, right before the French Revolution, then everything will be all right. Well, that's not true. It goes much deeper than that, and I hope we understand that now. So if we do understand that, then we understand that no amount of conservatism or worship of a golden age or nostalgia for the past, no amount of turning back the clock, unless you want to turn back the clock hundreds of thousands of years, which I don't think anyone, unless your name is Ted Kaczynski, I don't think you're really prepared to do that. And if your name is Ted Kaczynski, well, that's not a very good strategy. Because, unfortunately, no one's going to listen to you. Because the mass media is controlled by technocrats and merchants. They're never going to distribute your message. And the only way to promote your message and to get it to be heard and to get people to understand it, to proselytize it, and to have your anti-industrial revolution would be to reach a critical mass of people. Because the elite, the people who have power, are never going to listen to that kind of message. It doesn't benefit them. It's not it is not to their benefit to get rid of technology, because they are the harnessers of technology. And you cannot reach the masses without having control of the media. And to control the media, you need money. And to control money, you need mercantile power. You need technological power. An anti-industrial revolution can never work. It will never work. When we look at things like peak oil and things that were promised to roll back the tide of technology, these things have been predicted for decades and decades. They haven't come to pass. They will never come to pass. What will happen is antinatalism will solve the problem. You'll wipe out billions of people simply by not having children. Oh, well, Africans are having a lot of children. Well, Africans will continue to have children so long as their conditions continue to improve, which they are. And as soon as they cease to improve, antinatalism will be introduced to Africa, and within a single generation, you can wipe out a population by introducing and thoroughly indoctrinating the children with the ideas and ideology of antinatalism, which are multifarious. They are both atheism, they are feminism, it's a many-headed serpent. But nonetheless, it is easy to do. It has been demonstrated that you can take a fertile country like Germany, where women were praised for having 8 children, for having many, many children, and you can turn that around in a matter of decades and bring fertility down below replacement level. You can do this anywhere. You can do it with authoritarian methods, as the one-child policy in China has done, or you can do it through democratic, mercantile methods sponsored by international finance, through the media, through the school system, through control of the churches, and so on and so forth. So entertainment is a good way to indoctrinate people. So this is where we are, and I guess you could say, oh, this is very cynical, this is very sad. You're saying that those people of the warrior disposition will just have to suffer and die, and there's no solution for them. And I guess you could say that is what I am saying, and there is no way out of this technological, what is the Heideggerian term? Is it Gestell? Because I'm thinking of Gestalt, which is a form. Gestell. Oh, I forgot the E in Gestell. Gestell is a German word used by Heidegger to describe what lies beneath or underneath modern technology. Das Gestell, to put into place a gathering or collection. The mode of ordering, framing an encompassing view of technology not as a means to an end, but a mode of human existence. Indicates that all has been enframed. It is an enframing. Enframing means the gathering together of that setting upon which sets upon man, challenges him forth to reveal the real, the mode of ordering as standing reserve. Enframing means that way of revealing, which holds sway in the essence of modern technology, and which itself is nothing technological. Gestell has an active role. It is the performative gathering together for the purpose of revealing or presentation. A metaphor of a river generating electricity, or the earth revealed as a coal mining district. Gestell explains the violence of technology, drives out every other possibility of revealing, conceals that revealing in the sense of poesis, lets what presence come forth in appearance. Now, poesis is probably Greek, the activity to bring out something that was not known before. Mortals strive for immortality in relation to poesis. Natural poesis through sexual reproduction. Poesis in the city through attainment of heroic fame. Poesis in the soul through cultivation of virtue and knowledge. Bringing forth in the widest sense. Okay, well, that's all very interesting. So you're learning things, perhaps. I'm learning things, perhaps. We're learning about Gestell. But we live in a Gestell. We live in an framing that surrounds us, and we can't escape it, and that is where we are at. You cannot turn back the clock of civilization or technology. Maybe internally, within yourself, you can go live in the woods like Ted Kaczynski did, but you're not going to be able to change the state of humanity as a whole. And so there are two choices. You cannot be a warrior. You can be a priest. You can try to develop your own spirituality and hope that you're reincarnated, or you go to heaven, or you escape this Gestell, this enframing. Or you can go the path of the merchant. You can be successful that way. Now, as relates to whiteness, white nationalism as a majoritarian warrior ethos will not survive. It is a scarecrow. It is held up to be beaten and battered as a justification for increased mercantile power. White nationalism cannot succeed. It will not succeed because it is tied to a warrior ethos. The only types of people who can survive are those who are spiritual, first and foremost. Perhaps some spiritual power can survive this enframing. Perhaps it can survive this technology. I'm not sure, but if you believe in that, maybe you believe this material reality, this current life is not all we have. Maybe we have an eternal soul which lives on long after our material body is dead, or we go to some other universe or a parallel reality. Maybe that is possible, and therefore there is a spiritual solution, perhaps in Christianity or Hinduism or otherwise. But that is one path, and the other path is the path of the merchant. And the path of the merchant, when we look at white people, as I've described Jews before, Jews went through a process where they were refined as a people to become the perfect merchants. Merchants existed before the Jews, and other merchants exist outside the Jews, but they themselves are very adept at being merchants because of their history. Now, what is going to happen with white people is the warrior class will be hollowed out, and they will diverge into two paths. There will be the white people who are spiritual, and we will see what comes of that. Maybe the Amish, maybe pagans, maybe white people will form a new religion, maybe Christians will survive in some capacity. But then there will be those white people who are merchants. And the middle, which is the warrior class, and the warrior ethos will be hollowed out in the same way that among the Jews were once a nation with a population pyramid. Gilad Atzmon describes this, where you have the working class Jews, the middle class Jews, the upper class Jews. That pyramid has been turned upside down, where there are very few working class Jews, there's a middle class, and then there's a huge upper class of Jews. This works out economically to mean that it's like 48% of the 1% in America are Jewish, that the majority of Jews are again, these large numbers of Jews are in the top income brackets and so on and so forth, because they're specialized as a population. Well, what the anti-white trends are going to do is it's going to put pressure on European populations to either fall into the lower class and mix with the incoming refugees and the incoming immigrants. Men and women will intermarry and intermix, and they will no longer be white, and they will be part of what Keller described as this mixed underclass. And then there will be some white people who preserve themselves because they are wealthy, and they will live in these enclaves, these settlements of millionaires, these gated communities, which still exist, by the way, in South Africa. We can see specifically in South Africa this dynamic play out, where the Boers, the farmers, the warrior class, because again, we say that the farmers are the closest thing to first you have the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, then you have the farmer loses his way and becomes the industrial worker loses his way and becomes the cubicle worker worker loses his way and becomes the programmer in his basement, and what's next, who can tell? Some brain in a jar. But the farmer is the closest thing we have to a warrior. And so the Boer represents the warrior ethos of white people in South Africa, and that is why the Boer is attacked. Even though the Boer is rich, the farm owners are often rich, he is still attacked for this reason, which is implicit, which people understand implicitly, even if they don't understand explicitly. I'm just explicating it for you. And poor white people don't do well in South Africa. Poor white people either have to leave or get killed or live in a deprived state. And you have one little dot on the map, which is Orania, which is a white settlement, which is under threat. It can be dissolved at any day that the federal government decides to dissolve it. They are not allowed to defend themselves or keep weapons. Certainly not weapons that could defend themselves from tanks. They don't have tanks or anything. They don't have an air force, right? They are like the Amish. They are indefensible from a military standpoint. So this is the position of white people in South Africa, and yet rich white people still live in South Africa. Rich white people and Jews still control the economy. They still control the diamond mines in Africa. All of this post-colonial expulsion of white people has resulted in the transnational neoliberal imperial vision, which is not about colonizing with bodies, but it is about colonizing through the stock market. And this is how the economies of Africa are controlled, and these are the economies of Africa benefit people like Soros and Bill Gates and these kind of transnational billionaires. They benefit from the population explosion that's happening in Africa because Africans are very good consumers. They love to buy new styles of clothing. They love to buy the newest iPhone. They are very attracted to that which is new and that which is trendy. And they make good consumers. So they are part of a neoliberal program for economic expansion. And this is what's going to continue to happen. So white people will not be exterminated, but they will be shuffled into these two classes. They will be shuffled out of the warrior class, which again is this traditional European, everyone should be a warrior. That is the Paleolithic Northern European hunter-gatherer mindset. Everyone should be a warrior. Well, that is now Nazism, and Nazism is evil, and therefore everyone is going to have to be a merchant or a priest. Those are your two choices. You don't get a third choice. The white nationalists are deluded. They are looking at a fantasy world. They think that the world works in cycles, when actually we're seeing a big, just long teleology here. We're not seeing a cycle between back and forth. We're just seeing a pretty pure teleology. The only way I see out of this, in a return of the warrior class, is if we get some kind of transhumanist experiment or some kind of artificial intelligence that can wage war in a sophisticated way to blow the merchant class out of the water. That is the only way I see out of this gestell, this enframing of technology as a mercantile activity, and this would transform technological civilization once again into the realm of a warrior ethos, governing the behavior of these superhumans, as Nietzsche said, the Übermenschen, those who are from humanity but who are beyond humanity, whether that is an artificial intelligence or a transhumanist experiment, I cannot predict. But that is the only way I see out of this. If you absolutely cannot abandon the warrior spirit and you're willing to abandon your humanity, perhaps this is a solution. But if you don't see that in the cards, which many people do argue against the singularity as a dream, as very similar to the concept of the second coming of Christ or something which has not happened but has remained a hope of many Christians for 2,000 years, perhaps the singularity is another myth of utopia, which is not coming. And if that is the case, then certainly the warrior class is not making a comeback. The warrior class will continue to decrease in its potency and its importance. Military matters will more and more become a question of media. They will more and more become a question of cybersecurity, cyber attacks, things which have nothing to do with the body, things which purely have to do with how many computer geeks and nerds and hackers can you hire who are using their brains and not using their bodies. And things will continue in this way. And those who are successful and those who will survive and have power will either be of a priestly nature or of a mercantile nature. And you have to decide which one you fit into. If you feel you would be good at joining the neoliberal order and parroting the victimary totem pole, then perhaps you would do well in the corporate world, which is fully neoliberal in character. Perhaps you would do well as a banker. Perhaps you would do well as an entrepreneur or something like this, and you can make your $1 million, and you can live in a white-gated community in California, and you can have your own little ethno-state, which many rich white people already have. If that option is not open to you because your disposition is anti-mercantile, then you have to join some kind of spiritual community or live as Ted Kaczynski did out in the woods. But there is no third path. There is no warrior path. The spree shooters are deluded. They are only hurting their fellow citizens. They are not hurting the people in power. They are used as a scarecrow. They are used as a propaganda tool in order to scare the populace into giving up even more and more of the warrior ethos, into greater enframing of a mercantile empire, as George Orwell predicted, but also not just 1984, but what is the other one? There is, and let me make sure I'm looking it up right. Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. See, I didn't even have to look it up. All I have to do is open a new tab, and that's enough to trigger my memory and help me remember. Aldous Huxley, yes. So this has all been predicted. It is fairly predictable. It is nothing really original that I'm saying, but this is the message of Jokkul to all of the Jokkulites here listening to the Mr. Cool Mug podcast, that this is what is going on. So you have to choose. Are you going to be practical? Are you going to choose the route of survival? Are you going to convert to Judaism? Are you going to become a banker? Are you going to become rich? Because there are many hedonic pleasures to be experienced. There are many trips on Jeffrey Epstein's private airline and many trips to his private island to be had, and many enjoyable black magic rites and all kinds of satanic pleasures to engage with. Or you can join the spiritual-minded people in their little Amish or pseudo-Amish little cults, or you can try to transcend this reality and connect with other parallel universes or something like that. Or you can become a Christian and try to go to heaven. I mean, so there are paths that are open on the spiritual side, and there are many ways to make money. But the idea that you're going to get out of this situation through the warrior ethos is not realistic. And people who try to sell that, they're usually government actors, government agents. Whether they know it or not is another question. But they are patsies. They are used by the system in order to be scarecrows, in order to serve as little pieces of propaganda. Look at these evil Nazis who are shooting their own fellow countrymen, and this is the reason why we need to repeal the Second Amendment. And this is the reason why anyone who uses the term immigrant in a derogatory way should be thrown in jail or executed. You know, so we can always get more harsh. It can always get worse, and it will get worse, and there are only two ways out, and you have to choose which one you want. So, Jokkulites, I entertain your opinions. I entertain your comments. I look forward to hearing from what you have to say, and I will see you again on the next episode of the Mr. Cool Mug podcast. Have a great morning. Bye-bye.